good to go.
Okay, there we go. I'm going to just close off a few things. So I had the lovely pleasure of getting a really nasty virus in my laptop this week, and so the good news was I didn't lose any files, but you know, so IT rebuilt my laptop, and that's all fine, but you forget how much is preloaded, right, with your passwords, and this is set up and that's set up. So I've had the fun pleasure for the last 2 days of resetting everything up. Let's see, let's get rid of that. Let's get rid of that. Oh, for goodness sakes, go away. Okay, so can you guys see my screen?
No.
Okay. Are you supposed to be able to, or am I just controlling?
I can see it. Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, so Mary, this is just a standard screen share where I need to just pull up
your PowerPoint.
My PowerPoint. Okay, so it's not coming from you. Okay, I can do that real quick. Let's see. There we go. We have everybody or everyone we're expecting. Do you want me to go ahead and get started, Mary?
Yeah, we have about 12 people, I think, on the line. So I think
that's good.
Dive in.
Okay. Yeah, and I know a couple of us have a hard stop at the top of the hour, so we'll try and get through all this information. I can tell you Domain 1 is really large. So there's areas that we'll get into a little deeper, and then some areas that we'll go through pretty lightly and then give some suggested follow-up readings. Let's see. So this domain includes management, globalization, strategic planning and thinking, branding and positioning, and financial management. The lenses you'll want to keep in mind for Domain 1. Did everybody on the call take the CAE kickoff course in early September?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So we remember these from classes in terms of lenses. They certainly apply to Domain 1. So keep in mind strategic thinking, judgment-based decision-making, relationships, and our SPY mnemonic, which is scan, plan, implement, and evaluate. I'm going to skip through these real quick. These were Tanika's, and I'm going to go down to financial management. So this is one of the larger parts of the exam, and for non-financial managers, I know this causes considerable angst. So I'll go through some things at a high level. As the Chief Staff Officer, you need to be aware of the financial position at all times. This is one of your key responsibilities. The board has overall fiduciary responsibility for assets, but the day-to-day management and metrics and implementation are the responsibility of the Chief Staff Officer. It's also the Chief Staff Officer's obligation to keep the board informed. This needs to be timely, this needs to be accurate, and it needs to be transparent. A little note about that, in the transparency department, the financial statements, which we'll get to later, have a prescribed format, right, according to GAAP. The interim financial statements that are prepared by staff and the other reports about metrics, the important thing there is that financial statements are a management tool, and that means they need to be useful to management. And what is useful to one organization or one group of managers versus another can be different. So there's actually flexibility in how you present outside of GAAP in your formal financial statements. There's flexibility on how to present financial information to your board, to your finance committee, because the overall goal is to have useful information. So that's something to keep in mind. We need to be aware of the definitions of accrual accounting versus cash accounting, and the existence of GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles. Does anyone need to go through the accrual versus cash discussion? I know they hit it pretty hard in our class. Okay, I'm going to move on. I think I told all of you on our first call that this is my area of background. So if I'm going through this too slowly, too quickly, just let me know. Sometimes it's hard when you're close to a topic. Okay, we have our 3 types of budgets: capital, operating, and cash. When I was looking at some practice exam questions, I ran across one that was talking about which one do you do first, and it's actually your capital budget you do first. And I was a little surprised by that, honestly, but I believe the philosophy there is around, you have to lay out your bigger asset needs, and then you can come into an operating budget, which is more the, daily, monthly, yearly operations, sources of cash, uses of cash, and then, of course, your cash budget comes last. Is there any of these three that you want me to dive into a little deeper? Does anyone have any questions on the types or the roles of these budgets? Okay. Of course, we should, there's the direct expenses that go to program budgets, but it's, strongly encouraged that you allocate labor to your different programs, and even some make the argument that you should allocate overhead in terms of, costs of just, building, general and administrative expenses and the like, so you can really understand the true costs of your program budgets. Okay, I always love this statement. Financial statements in some way are your true strategic plan. This is literally where you put your money where your mouth is in the organization. And so, yes, of course, in a perfect world, you have a strategic plan, and your strategic plan drives your budget. But if there's any discrepancies, where you're spending your money and earning your money is what is actually happening versus what is written down on the strategic plan document. So keep that in mind. Budgets are prepared by staff with input from the board and different committees and whatever your stakeholder groups are, and then presented to the board for approval. It's pretty common for, I think, most of us to present the board to a finance and audit committee, or at least finance committee first, and then it filters into the board. And that whole structure changes based on how your governance structure is set up, right? How strong of a role your finance committee has, if the board has actually delegated any authority to the finance committee or not around decisions around the budget. Just a little bullet on staff responsibility that I added because I can see questions talking about roles and responsibilities on this. Okay, the big three in financial statements. We have the statement of financial position, which is really your balance sheet. This is a point in time. This is your assets, liabilities, and net assets. Statement of activities, more commonly known as an income statement. It's your revenue and expenses over a period of time. And then the statement of cash flows, which are your sources and uses of cash over a period of time. In any of these, comparables are really important, whether you're comparing current month to prior month, year-to-date this year versus year-to-date last year, actual versus budget, actual versus prior year, whatever comparables make sense for your organization and what you're trying to monitor, but comparables are very important in all of this. That's where you get your real information, honestly. This I found, I'm not going to read this to you, but if you need a deeper dive on net assets and the types of net assets in terms of restricted, unrestricted, permanently restricted, here's some information here, as well as some stuff on gains and losses. Oops. Okay, we went over some of these ratios in the class in September. I think based on what I read in terms of the exam questions and content, it's going to be important to just flat out memorize what these ratios are, but also understand what it's getting at. So your current ratio is really telling you, do you have enough money to pay your debts? Your quick ratio is similar, but it really boils it down to cash. Do you have enough cash to pay your debts? So if you think about it, the current ratio up above, current assets, that includes inventory and prepaid. Well, if the whole world goes to hell in the handbasket and tomorrow you have to pay all your debts, you would need time to sell off your inventory. You would need time to convert your prepaids, right? So your liquidity is really what cash you have to pay off your current liabilities. Your reserve ratio is your net assets divided by your total annual expenses. This is really how much of the organization's budget is covered by available assets. You see questions around this when they talk about reserve policies, and there's kind of two ways to look at reserves. There is, the net assets of the organization, right, which is where your income has been accumulating since the inception of the organization, and that's certainly a reserve that hasn't been spent per se. There's cash and non-cash elements to that. So you also, and we'll get to this in a minute, talk about reserves that are literally, financial accounts probably held at a brokerage firm, in some level of cash and securities and whatever else you've decided to invest in that are also considered reserves. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so I mentioned this earlier, the liquidity and current ratios measure your ability to pay debts. Your profitability ratio measures your performance relative to sales or assets. I didn't see any samples of profitability ratios anywhere. I don't know if anyone has any or has tripped across any yet. But this is really more your, almost like ROI, but not just restricted to the income statement, right? So, how much net income do you have versus sales? How much net income do you have versus your assets or net assets? And then the activity ratios are around how quickly you can convert receivables to cash. So that might be your, I can't remember the technical name, but your average number of days to collect receivables, for example. Okay,
sorry,
go ahead.
On the profitability, is that the one I've seen some materials and questions that kind of reference taking into account the indirect costs like staff time and things like that. Is that, am I getting that confused with ROI, or is that more applicable to the profitability?
No, to truly calculate profitability, you would include, allocations of personnel and overhead.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? Okay. Okay, the Form 990. I'm sure most of you know it went through a major overhaul several years back, and the theory on that from the IRS was when organizations have good governance, then they're likely to have accurate financial statements and good reporting on their tax returns. That was the theory that they put out there. So they stopped short of requiring policies, but they asked a whole ton of questions about what you have in the area of governance, right? Everything from conflict of interest, records retention, whistleblower, reserve policies, all of the executive compensation pieces, foreign bank accounts, all of that kind of stuff. So you check the boxes, yes or no, and in a lot of areas, if you don't have a policy, they give you an opportunity to say why. And they, the idea is that I think if you're checking a lot of boxes no, then you might get flagged as being a little bit more at risk for accurate financial reporting. Okay, unrelated business income. The three parts to the definition are it's carried on as a trade or business, it's not related to your tax-exempt purpose, and it's regularly carried out. It's not, a one-time or incidental thing. There are some special exceptions. Well, let me make a comment. Not related to your exempt purpose. That is in the opinion of the IRS, not the opinion of the organization. The organization is going to take a position around things if they ever get into it with the IRS. But you have to be careful on this, that we don't own, as CSEs or as nonprofit organizations, we don't own the decision around what's related to our exempt purpose or not. The IRS really gets to say what they believe is or isn't. They've carved out some exceptions around trade shows and royalties. You're not paying tax on the gross revenue from these programs. You get to net the direct and indirect expenses and then calculate tax. There is a really great PDF in the Collaborate section, the CAE exam prep, domain 1. There's a whole, I don't know how many pages it is, I think it's just a couple pages on UBET that really goes through all of the aspects. So if this is an area you're unfamiliar with, I would download that form. And I did read somewhere that it's a common exam question to know the different types of unrelated business income. Any questions on that? Okay. Tanika, did I see that you joined? Maybe not yet. Okay. Okay. Internal controls. Some of this is review from our class, the 4 parts of a transaction: initiation, authorization, custody, and recording. You try to separate these among staff. Remember the CSE mindset for this exam was an organization of at least 50 employees, and I think they said $5 million or somewhere in that range. If you are part, or if your background and experience is in smaller organizations, it can get difficult to separate these, and so you kind of have alternate procedures to sort of safety net that situation. But because in the exam we're really looking at larger organizations, or what I would consider larger organizations, they very likely have the opportunity in their accounting department to separate these functions. So keep yourself in that larger organization CSE mindset on these questions. You know, part of internal controls is the policies, and these are the elements of financial policies around lines of authority, definition of the responsibility, a level of acceptance, and they often talk about that in a job description, that you've accepted responsibility for this function, your authority, you know, lines up with your responsibility, and that you've been properly trained. Okay, audits and reviews. I think the important piece on this is that to remember that an audit expresses an opinion. They don't come in and validate all of your numbers. They come in and use analytics and other, you know, processes consistent with auditing standards to express, you know, an opinion that your financial statements are free of, you know, material misstatement. That doesn't mean they're perfect. That means there's that material, right, within reason, within some dollar figure reason, and they literally calculate out what that dollar amount is. This accurately reflects the financial position of the organization. There's the 3 types of opinions, which you should just straight up memorize, and then the management letter, if you get one. Typically, you know, an organization has a clean audit and there's no management letter. Now, the management letter is kind of an intermediate piece. You can get a clean opinion. Well, let me back up on that. I don't want to say that. The management letter is shared with the board, but it's areas that need to be addressed by management to be compliant with GAAP. So this is where if your internal controls are weak, if your financial policies are weak, they're going to have comments about that. One of the key ways that auditors you know, get enough comfort level that they can express an opinion is they don't always test all your numbers, but they test your controls, right? So if they believe your financial policies are good and they're being applied consistently and accurately, then they can trust that the numbers are good. It's not that they always come in and directly test the numbers. And you know, some organizations they do, some organizations they don't. With the bigger organizations, it's too expensive and unwieldy to test all the numbers, so they really do a lot of testing of controls. Sarbanes-Oxley, honestly, just if you have the law handbook, go read Chapter 10. It outlines it really, really well. And again, it's pretty clear on, what was there, like 9 or 10 elements to Sarbanes-Oxley. Really, 1 and sort of 2 were directly, you know, explicitly related to nonprofits, but in reality, most nonprofits, and it's considered good governance, have adopted all of the elements of Sarbanes-Oxley, even though it was written for corporations primarily. Any questions on the audit and review cycle? Excuse me. Okay. Reserve policies. Here's the elements of a reserve policy. Again, unfortunately in the financial management section, I think there's just some straight up memorization pieces. I would just memorize these elements of a good reserve policy. In this reserve policy, this is talking about not your net assets, which we sometimes conceptually think about as a reserve, but this is literally around your investment accounts, right, and what you're putting aside in your different operating reserve funds and the like. Investment policies, again, I would just memorize the policies to include, or the parts of the policy. I looked around for a fun mnemonic and didn't find anything. So if anyone finds a fun mnemonic to memorize these pieces, I'm sure the group would love that. So I should back up. Is there anything in either of these in particular, the components of these policies that anyone had a question on or wanted a little more information about? Okay. All right, let's do a couple sample questions. In the financial reporting, materials presented should have 3 elements. Which of the following elements is not one of them? Anyone want to make a guess?
B?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
I said B.
Yeah. Yeah, tell us about your rationale on that. I would agree with that. How did you come to that?
Well, the word all-inclusive is usually a red flag. Always, never, any sort of like absolute wording triggers a red flag for me. So all-inclusive, that right away. And then I read the others, and those were all good. And also you mentioned earlier that the reports just need to be useful to the board and to the staff. Obviously, they don't need to include every piece of information. So, you know, they've got to follow GAAP, got to be clear and easy, and complete according to what the policy says. Those all sound good. So obviously not all-inclusive. That's my rationale.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. And I think that some of the key words in the question is they said financial reporting, not financial statements, right? So in financial reporting is where you get that, you know, flexibility where the report must be completed according to board policy, right? If these were financial statements, you know, GAAP would certainly apply. We can all debate about whether GAAP is clear and easy for readers to understand, but, right? So financial reporting was the other thing that popped out for me in addition to what you shared. Any questions from anyone on why that's the right answer? Okay, let's go on to another one. Which of the following is an element of a clean audit opinion?
Is it A?
It is. Tell us why you thought it was A.
So assurance is kind of the words that I keyed in on there because they're providing assurance, and the whole idea of the clean audit is exactly that, that your statements represent fairly the position and financial health, I guess, of the organization.
Very good.
B was right away, I thought, wrong. And C is talking about operations and not as much documentation and kind of the controls that you talked about earlier. And then D specifically talks about cash flow. So that's kind of how I got there.
Yeah, those are all true. The only thing I would add to that is, you know, your audited financial statements include statement of financial position, statement of activities, and your statement of cash flow. So in C or D, they're only referencing one of those elements, so I would throw those out immediately. And then, yeah, B is just that throwaway answer, which leads us to A. Okay. Did I add anything else in here? Yeah. Okay, last sample question on financial management. To manage day-to-day operations optimally, which of the following key financial reports would be of the least value to you as the Chief Staff Executive? C, was that?
Yeah.
Tell us why C.
Oh, because it's not a financial report.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a fun one. Yeah, all the other statements have value in monitoring the financial picture was a key role of the CSE, and the letter is just an assurance or opinion about a prior period. Okay, let me see. Tanika, are you on yet?
Yes, I'm here.
Do you want to switch to yours, or do you mind if I keep going?
You can keep going.
Okay. All right. The self-assessment, just some resources. The self-assessment questions in the CAE study guide, page 68, I thought were really good in terms of making sure you not only know the information but can apply it. Again, in Collaborate, there is this from, I think it looked like from a study group from the spring. There is a document called 100 Club Domain 1 Financial Management Notes Revised. There's a lot of good information in there if you don't want to take your own notes. And then if you have the Professional Practices and Association Management book, I would read chapter 2, 8, 13, and 35. And they're pretty short chapters, most of them, so it's not too onerous. Okay, any questions on financial management before we move on to branding and positioning? I'll kind of watch our time here. Okay. All right, branding and positioning. This is not my area of expertise, so I'm going to present what I've learned, but if others are more well-versed in this, feel free to jump in. So this is about an environmental scan to inform your branding and positioning strategies. This is about identifying your unique value proposition for your association, and then, of course, integrating your brand throughout the organization. Those are some key elements to branding and positioning. So what is a brand? A brand is a promise of consistency to your external audience. And I think it's, in the stuff that I've read, it's key to think of it as a promise around how you're going to behave, and it's important to be consistent with that. When you have a strong brand, it can save time, right? It bolsters trust because it's clear about conveying expectations. And the truth is, branding happens whether you manage it or not. I mean, you will have a brand, right? And if you actively manage that to be the brand you want it to be, then good. And if you don't, you will still have a brand, and it probably won't be very flattering. This was on the bottom here. Associations influence brands, but ultimately the target audience's control, right? The perception of who you are is more controlling than who you want to portray yourself as. So when you're successful at your branding, those two things are in sync. If you're not successful in your branding, then those two things might be out of sync. So these lenses get used in a variety of different places, but certainly in branding and positioning, there's scanning. You're looking at socio-demographics, technology, economics, environment, and politics. We have our mnemonic STEEP about that. Okay, environmental scanning. This comes up in a couple different areas. So this is straight off of that Professional Practices and Association Management, page 24. I think this is something to just memorize. So there's change that occurs in cycles, right? It's usually pretty predictable. You know, seasons change. They use the example of ice ages, which I thought was a little bit of a stretch, but there might be certain business cycles that you're used to. You know, I work in a university environment, so we have, you know, an academic year, those kind of cycles. You have wild card events. You know, these are big things. This is 9/11, fall of the Berlin Wall. You know, really difficult, if not impossible, to anticipate. It's one time, it's sudden, and it's very disruptive. Trends is change over time and in a consistent direction over time. Trends are not new. You know, if something's new, it's more of an emerging issue. Once it becomes a trend, it's been happening. You have data about this, and you've been observing, you and potentially others have been observing this for a while. Emerging issues, you know, somewhat self-explanatory. We're going to get into a little bit of this futures analysis, and this is where futures analysis focuses on emerging issues. Scenario planning. So getting back to, this is more on the positioning, right? And there's a lot of overlaps with strategic planning in this, which Tanika is going to talk about, so you'll be seeing some of this information again. But when you think about positioning your organization, you know, doing that environmental scan of the future, and doing some scenario planning. So through your scan, you're going to identify some change drivers. Scenario planning is stories. You're telling stories about the future. These aren't predictions, and there's more than one story because there's more than one possible alternative. When you do, there's a great chapter in that Professional Practices and Association Management book that goes through all of this. There's just functionally, in terms of, you know, literally people in the room, whether you're doing this with staff or with the board, you need to have some agreements. You know, we're gonna tell stories that are plausible, you know, but not probable. Oh, sorry, that should say probable. You don't want to take your stories to be so far out of the ballpark that they're unlikely to happen, right? I mean, that's, you know, you're not trying to come up with a scenario that would have predicted 9/11, for example. You need plausible stories, and you need more than one story. In this process, you have to be willing to suspend disbelief when thinking is challenged, right? You can't, you know, narrow this down to one. You can't, you know, be closed-minded to the process. Does that make sense? More or less?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Again, I probably went in too much detail on this futures analysis. It's all in the professional practices for association management. But I thought this was interesting, and I can see some potential questions about this. When you're looking out into the future, you're not just looking at trends that are affecting your members, but, well, where you can really get good data and information about how, you know, the trends and emerging issues out there, or when you look at your customers' customers, right, or when you look at your associate members' customers, and what's going on in their customer world that then is going to come back and impact the member. And then how can the association, you know, keep pace with the members' needs around this change that's happening to their customers? Here's just 5 parts to futures analysis. You're identifying and monitoring change. You're considering and critiquing the impacts of change. This is where the stories come in. Imagine conceivable alternative futures. Again, you can use the stories to illustrate that. Go through a visioning process around your preferred futures, and then you plan and implement the desired change, which, you know, ultimately should result in your preferred future, at least around the factors you can control. Okay, question. CSE has been charged with using an environmental scan data to inform key publics of branding and positioning strategies. External experts have been hired to assist the organization in identifying steep. During the scanning process, change areas will be identified, 2 of which can be efficiently leveraged. They are, what does anyone think?
C.
C?
Yep.
Why C?
And trends. Why C?
Mm-hmm.
Because I remember very specifically in the reading they were pointing to emerging issues and trends as things that you can actually look at, and the others just, you know, wild card events obviously you can't predict.
Right.
So those B and D are out. And cycles, I don't remember what cycles are. I just know that emerging issues and trends are definitely the ones.
Yeah, cycles are the predictable things that happen over and over again, right? Like change of the seasons, right? So that probably isn't going to give you your big change drivers.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Let's see. Yeah, okay. Again, for this section, that professional practices and association management, chapters 3 and 29, was suggested reading, as well as the Association Law Handbook, chapter 8. There was not anything in Collaborate in the domain folders around branding and positioning. So these chapters were all I found. Okay, let me go back up to Tanika's section. And then, Mary, can we take it off of me and turn it over to her?
Absolutely.
Okay. Or do I have to give it back to you? Is that how this works?
I can hand it over.
Okay.
All right. Tanika should have it now.
Okay.
I didn't load the presentation. I'm sorry. Hold on. If you, I think you can just give me the mouse. Correct? Or just give me a second. I'll load it.
Pam, do you still have it up?
I do.
Yeah, I think you can give her the keyboard and mouse.
Okay, let's see.
If that's easier.
Choices over here. Show my shop. Give keyboard and mouse.
Thank you.
Two. Okay. All right, it's all you.
Thank you. Just make sure I have control of the yes, I do. Okay. Good evening. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to talk about general management, globalization, and strategic thinking planning. This domain is huge, so I pulled out things that I thought that was important for people to know about the different sections. So important to know about general management is to make sure that you identify and define what the association is uniquely good at, ensure operations and activities play to strength and accommodate weaknesses, and leveraging internally or in partnership. Okay. So the important things to know when you are working for an association, it doesn't matter what position you are in, the difference between the two main categories. There's different 501c categories, but the two main ones are 501c6, which deals with like membership, trades, and different organizations like that, and they are allowed to lobby. And then we have 501c3s, which are usually foundations that have to do with education, religious, scientific, charitable events, and it's limited lobbying. And then we have the for-profits, which are subsidiaries, corporations. So many organizations, they don't want to risk their tax-exempt status, so they make a for-profit one and to do insurance or other businesses, so it won't interfere with that. I think the governance domain will talk more about this, but if you want to know information about the 5 reasons why nonprofits does for-profit, you can look at page 73 of the professional practice, and it gives you more information about that. Okay. Now, also, this is like the holy grail of associations. You should know all 4 of these, and in the order that they are, because this will be probably typical questions on the exam. Articles of incorporation, bylaws, policies and procedures, and then practices. Practices are, what organizations do in-house. It's not required, but it's just a part of working. The 2 focuses in this section is policies and procedures. So just knowing the difference between the 2, and of course, policies set parameters or specify mandates for actions and decision making, and this is good also in strategic planning. We'll talk about that later. And then procedures are step-by-step process detailing how to accomplish a task in the document. This information, the definitions, can be found in the study group, the CAE study guide under terms and key terms. So if you want to refresh your memory on that stuff. Okay, and then when you're dealing with general management, you need to know what your internal factors are and external factors that can be a positive or negative impact on your organization. You need to understand this as a CSE, since we're supposed to be thinking and have the mindset of a CSE. So this is something that you need to know. Again, internal is operational. It has to do with finance, return on investment, overhead. External can be leadership and membership. Volunteer engagement, that can also have an effect on the organization structure. Okay. There are additional sections in the general management part, and I could not talk about everything, but I do want to stress that succession planning is very important, and you need to have a succession plan available just in case of, leaders, your management or CEO or the CSE, something happens, retirement, death, so you have to have a good plan established. This includes what the position requires, insurances, and other factors as well. In this section, it also talks about change and innovation. Some of what Pam talked about, we will be discussing. It's involved in all parts. So those are some important things, understanding and establishing core values to provide a framework for effectively managing the association. And then also project management, of course, quality control and staff knowledge development. Also understanding the difference between top-down versus bottom-up. That's also in the book. And basically, top-down is when a national organization plays a primary role and collects dues and then distributes, divided amongst the local and state chapters. And bottom-up is the reverse, basically. Okay, I have a question. So to divide, to give you all the chance to think. So before giving out personal information about its members, an association should, which answer would you choose?
I would guess D.
Agreed.
Have board policies on the.
Okay.
Can we talk about why?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So the answer is D, and if you want to talk about why, we can. I kind of put it there, but.
I have a question. Would it be board policies or just membership? Like, would we have overarching policies? That might have mixed me up, just having the word board in there.
Well, it's dealing with different policies, and you're right. This is probably to fall under membership as well. Anytime you're dealing with, I hear an echo, so I don't know if everyone else hears it. And bother anyone, but policies, it doesn't matter if it's a board or a membership. Policies are, basically set the parameters and specific mandates for action and decision making. So those policies probably would be a part of the board's decisions. It's just they use the board policies on here.
Well, if I can add to that, I think since the role of the board is to set policy, your member agreement is in your bylaws, right? And so bylaws don't really include policies; they're kind of broader than that. So board and policies together actually made a lot of sense to me.
Did anyone else have any? Did anyone else choose anything, or is just the way the question was structured, or the answers were structured? Shall I move on? Oh, I have 15 minutes. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, so let's talk about globalization. Some of the information that Pam discussed earlier, you need it for anything that you're doing, really. So environmental scanning is important in globalization because you need to identify, trends and if your organization should go global, or how it would affect. So you need to do an environmental scan. And again, we talked about why this is important, scenario planning. All of this is important when you're considering globalization. Again, we talked about types of change, emerging trends, and emerging issues and trends are a big part of it. If you want to learn more about emerging issues and trends, there's a great website called Trend Watcher. you might want to look at and kind of get an idea if you're not used to or understand that part of scanning. Okay, so when you are thinking about going global or if your organization is a global organization, you have to think about the countries that you're trying to establish or have business in. You got to think about the laws and regulations, because what we do in the United States may not be acceptable in other countries. So you have to think about that, the ethical standards, the culture, the language. Know your market and give them what they want. One size doesn't fit all. That's a big one that you need to know. And just tailor your programming, your structure to serve the international market. Okay. Let's move on to strategic plan real quick. And there's some key areas that I think it is important for you all to know out of this section. And this is one. When you're strategically planning and thinking, it's primarily about driving necessary change. So these are key points to know in strategic planning: thinking, planning, implementing, evaluation, and feedback. You know, assessing the future effects of outside forces for thinking, planning, create the association future based on the thinking, and implementation, execute plan, evaluate, and feedback, and how does this performance match the plan. There is, if you took the CAE study course, in the little workbook, it had a page that breaks down these categories and tell you where financial goes and membership goes and the different things that involve the organization. So if you don't have it, I can make a copy of it and get it scanned and have it available on the study group site. Also, when you are dealing with strategic planning, please understand that strategic plans drive the budget and not the other way around. So you first need to plan before you think about money. Basically, that's the point. And metrics, when you're dealing with metrics, you need to measure the right things. So that's also important. Okay. Now, this is important, and you should know this as well. The CSE and the board, again, Pam stated, focus on strategic, and the CSE and the staff is operational. So your board should not be into, you know, how you're spending your money and different things like that. It's operational, and then the board thinks about the future of the organization. So that's the difference. Mission statement: what does your why do your organization exist? Vision: to what future does it aspire? Core values: how is it work carried out? Goals and what specific outcomes are desired? Strategies: how will we reach our goals? Tactics: what specific steps will be needed? Objectives: what are the milestones and metrics? How can we measure the progress? When you are setting goals with your board, you should minimize it to 3 to 5. That's the standard practice. If you have 15 goals, many a times you're not going to accomplish that. So you should focus on between 3 and 5. Make sure you have both short and long-term goals, and make sure they align and support the goals, you know, with the staff, the budgets, volunteers, committees, etc. 5, again, is important in strategic planning. You find more about that on page 43 of the kickoff booklet. Again, that's helpful. And also, when you're dealing with strategic planning, developing funding strategies to address current and future needs are important in this section as well. Okay, so I have a couple of questions for you. A chief staff executive is trying to develop a high-performing board. The best way to facilitate this is to anyone wants to take a guess?
C.
C? This is Cheryl.
Yeah.
Okay, and anyone that want to state why?
I think that your board should be visionary, and just like what it says, is that they really should be focusing on where the organization is going and really not into the details, the details of the day-to-day kind of operation. You should be letting your committees and task forces such doing that work, and they should be really focusing on those outcomes and moving the organization forward.
And you are correct. So the important words that I took from the question is develop a high-performing board, which we talked about. And the board is supposed to be strategically thinking. So that's the reason why it's correct. Okay. Okay. So the next question I have for you is, your association president asked for your assistance in developing an agenda for the strategic management meeting. Which order should the following items appear on the agenda?
D?
D.
D.
I feel like everything we've read always says thinking first, thinking first.
Yeah.
Okay. And you are correct. And I just put it up on the slide as well. So that's why it's important to know it. Because I'm sure there's going to be questions about this, and we got to figure out how to put them in the right order. So I thought I would give you a challenge on that. Okay. So I just wanted to let you all know most of the finishing slides are some of what last week's slides were, but I did add an additional. Bob Harris, if you haven't heard about him, he is really big in association management. He has a website with tons of information, templates, best practices, you name it. He has it all on strategic planning, board management. At my previous organization, we had him speak at our events every year. He provided us with free stuff for the different local and state boards. So I would advise you to go look him up, research his website, and you might be able to find some information to help you study. So that's my addition to this. Again, we have a couple of additional activities coming out. We have the legal virtual lunch, the financial, and then the CRAM. Okay, I think that's it. Does anyone have any additional questions?